Welcome to Sculpture Vulture. I'm Lucy Branch, a sculptural conservator and author, bringing you a series of interviews with some amazing sculptors who inspire me, and I hope will do the same for you. You can see the photographs accompanying the interview, the episode show notes, and get a free novel from sculpturevulture.co.uk. Hello, Sculpture Vultures, and thank you for joining me. With all the terrifying world news that's going on at the moment, where if you're anything like me, I feel like I can do so little about, I find myself turning more and more to places where I seek solace, so my work, my writing, and I just wanted to say to all you sculptors out there, all you creatives, who might have moments now and then, as we all do, when you think, gosh, is what I do worth it? Is it worth all the effort and the struggle? And why don't I just go and do something easier where I'm paid by the hour? Just let me tell you, it's times like these where I turn to your work to feed my soul when it is depleted by terrible news. And your work is really important. And I'm sure cannot be the only person that gets this. And so I'm sure that my message represents lots of people in the world who you never, ever hear from. Every time they look at one of your sculptures or your creations, and they never think, oh, well, I'll just email that person and tell them how much it meant to me, but I'm going to be their voice for them. It really does. And you may not be heading up NATO or organising military procedures, but what you do is valuable, and there is immense comfort in that kind of distraction and that kind of nourishment that only sculptors and creatives can provide. I was interested to see that this week there is a proposal for Chelmsford to have a memorial to Agnes Waterhouse, who was the first woman executed for witchcraft in 1566. I had no idea that Essex had such a huge thing against witches. Not now, it makes it sound like I'm holding you accountable to it now. In its past, Essex apparently executed more witches than any other county in the country. And so it's particularly fitting that they get that memorial. And not that anyone is asking me my opinion, but I think this is exactly the kind of memorial that we need, particularly because witchcraft and the execution of so many women was such a heinous part of female history. And I know it wasn't only females that were executed. There were plenty of men who were also tried and found guilty of witchcraft. But I think we can all agree that, women got the lion's share of the noose. I'm, for one, definitely going to be watching and waiting and hoping that this memorial gets made. I think a really public, symbolic gesture like this is exactly what we need. It can't bring anyone back, but it can certainly make a statement, and it can certainly right a wrong that should have been righted a long time ago. On a completely different note, in the last episode with Mark Richards, I realised that we briefly touched on a policy in Ireland. We mentioned the tax breaks that artists can get over there, but actually I wasn't alluding to that when I mentioned it to Mark, and I suddenly thought, actually, maybe not everybody knows about this and it might be of interest to you. I was actually talking about a recent policy in Ireland to give over 2,000 artists an independent living wage. It's not a fortune, it's, kind of like a minimum wage level, but it is a basic support package which would enable artists to create without having that massive pressure that you have when, you have a certain level of bills, a certain level of living to manage to pay for. And what a brilliant commitment that is to creativity. And One of the big problems I often come across when I'm working out in the public domain and people come up to me and they say, "Oh, art, what a load of rubbish. We should be paying for more care homes." And I get it. There's no good argument for where money is best spent, because frankly, we just need more of it in every way, in every place in our culture. But art is so important, creativity is so important. And that's not to say that we haven't had a zillion examples of professionals who have made it over that hurdle and managed to get themselves a proper living from their creativity. They have, but my goodness, how hard can it be? It really is. And the idea that maybe you wouldn't have to take jobs just for buttons which completely deplete you in order to be able to be a creative, I think is just a magnificent idea. And I'm absolutely sure that it's going to be producing a really fertile yield in the future. I know some people would call it idealism, but I hope with all my heart that Ireland can keep that pledge going to its creatives. And in my mind, it's a bold step and quite a brilliant one. Today, I'm talking to Nicola Godden, who's a figurative sculptor. And although the majority of her work is for private owners, she's created some very well-known and loved monuments, including Icarus for London 2012 Olympic Village, Sir Peter Scott's sculpture for the London Wildfowl and Wetlands Centre in Barnes, and the Hammersmith Man for the Hammersmith Flyover, among others. I began our conversation today by asking, had sculpture first come into your life?
Well, I was quite young, I think, because I always, from a very, very young age, drew all the time. When I was little, I used to come up to my mother with drawings and she said, "Well, who did this?" And I would say, "Well, I did it." And she said, "No, don't be so ridiculous," And I used to just do drawing after drawing. I'd spend hours and hours drawing. And then apparently one day I went up to her and sort of made some movements with her hands. And I said, "I just want to do this," as if I wanted to build something. I had this sort of fancy about creating little people. And she went, and she went and got me some clay.
So she recognised it.
She did. I was obviously fooling about with it quite young. Yes, so I have to thank my mother for that.
So was that something, do you think, that she recognised from someone else in the family, or is that something she was looking out for particularly?
Not really. My father was very able. He could sort of pretty much do anything. He could draw, he could make anything, he could sing, he'd do all these things. It was just happen. I don't actually know where it came from at all, because it's strange, because my own daughter is like me and could draw from when she was tiny, but we don't know where it came from. So it's just one of those
there.
Things. Yeah. Well, anyhow, I remember my childhood was just drawing. I don't remember much more, but I just drew the whole time.
I was always hoping that one of my kids would be like that they would just draw and entertain themselves for hours. But unfortunately, I got the other variety who just want to be entertained all the time instead.
Oh dear, maybe it comes through in your grandchildren.
I'm really hoping for a nice, quiet one that just, gets on with it themselves. And was there someone in school that took you a little bit further along the line, or was it more at university?
Unfortunately, nobody at school. I honestly, throughout my whole school life, I don't think I was taught anything artistically. I went to boarding school in Somerset, and I was the only person who touched clay or did anything really. And they honestly didn't know what to do with me. So they just left me to it. I had no tuition at all. And even in my sixth form, really nothing. I mean, it's nothing like nowadays with the children. The art departments in some schools are fantastic.
Yeah.
And I thought, you lucky children. My children, I think, gosh, you've had every opportunity to explore everything and all these really enthusiastic teachers. And honestly, nothing when I grew up at all.
But I wonder, it's almost like they've gone to university before they've gone to university, kids, because I keep saying you're going to be really disappointed because, there was something to sort of look forward to by moving on to higher education in our day. But there isn't really now. Some of the schools are so set up. It's probably as good as a university department used to be.
absolutely. You know, that's what I thought too. You know, years ago, I thought, well, yes, what's going to happen when you go to art college? I mean, you've done it
Yeah,
all.
there's nowhere else to go.
You know. I do remember when I was a child, my mother, when I was little, said, when you're older, you're going to go to art college. And I was thinking, oh, how exciting. Oh, I can't wait, you know. And then when I got to art college, it was one of the most miserable times in my
Oh,
life. I hated it.
oh no. Where was it?
Well, it was local. It was Farnham.
Okay.
First day I went to a foundation year, which was a complete waste of time for me because I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to do sculpture, wasn't interested in experimenting, you know, with any of these other, well, whatever
Mediums.
they
Yeah.
did really. I mean, I just thought it was a complete waste of time. And then I went to the degree course and I was thoroughly miserable there too.
Oh, that's terrible.
It was awful. But it did, I was very, very figurative, as in realistic figurative. Sort of, I did that sort of work beforehand. And because I was so miserable at art college, it did change things. So actually, you know, looking back on it, it probably did me a lot of good because I started doing much more abstract work. And my unhappiness showed in my work, and it became sort of raw and very simplified and more abstracted, and actually was some of the best work I've ever done, I think, because I was so
Gosh.
miserable.
But I mean, it's incredible because that could have put you off. I mean,
Yeah.
there's sort of two ways to go with misery, isn't there? There's that sort of, sometimes it produces great work. You hear songs, you know, obviously a lot about love, people's hearts being broken. And you know, some of the lyrics are really spectacular and you think they'd have never got there without experiencing that heartbreak. But then there's also the part that just shuts the creativity down. It literally puts a lid on it because you're just in such pain.
I do wonder. I mean, I just think you just made me think of Sibelius. You know, I think that he wrote some of his best music because he was so upset.
Yeah. Yeah.
And people do, and I think that happened later on in my life when I was very unhappily married, and suddenly all this stuff started coming out, and I thought, oh, this is exciting.
Yeah.
There's an upside to this.
Yeah.
You know, it's a big change of style and work. So yeah, and perhaps angst is good for artists, I
Yeah,
think.
I just thinking about like all the war poetry and all the fantastic art that has come out of war, but it feels wrong somehow that something like that comes out of something so terrible. But I don't know how the I don't know the psyche works really.
We're talking about poetry too. I think when I was at at art college, we had to do we'd had to write something, and anyhow I started writing poetry because I was so miserable, and I wrote. I've never written poetry before, and I've never written it since really, and I just wrote this huge amount of poetry. It was all sort of the essence of what I felt. I was just trying to put it on paper.
And do you think that was that loneliness, or was it just not really getting what you were desperate for in the learning?
A sort of a bit of both, because I only, I think, really clicked with one person while I was at art college, and the chap who ran the department really shouldn't have been in charge of anything. He I don't know, caused a lot of trouble for me.
Oh no, sort of squats tried to snuff it out of you rather than encourage it.
Yeah, and he was very unpleasant to me. So yeah, I just tried to avoid him because I was a bit too sensitive. I didn't fight back. I was much more likely to sort of go off and cry in a corner. Very annoying, actually. So I think I wrote in some of the poetry while I was writing, and I did write about him once. And when he read it, he didn't recognize it was him until another member of staff told him.
Clearly not the most intuitive character then.
Really know. But anyhow, moving on.
Yes. I mean, when did it start to become a profession?
That was interesting because it wasn't until my degree show when some people were coming around, members of the public came round and saw the work, and people started asking if they could buy the odd drawing. I thought, what, buy something I've done? And then I'll never forget, a woman came around with her twin boys, who were probably 7 or 8 at the time, and she looked at one of these bronzes I'd cast of this very, very abstract figure. And she just stood there and she said, oh my God, I love it. And her boy said, oh, Mummy, why don't you buy it? And then she turned to me and said, can I buy this? And I thought, oh my goodness. I had no idea that art could have that effect on people, that something I could produce would give somebody else, something special.
Such pleasure. Yeah.
Yes, and suddenly I thought, oh my goodness, maybe I can do this. Maybe I could continue. And it was the most wonderful thing. That's why I've never forgotten it, because I'd love to meet the woman again.
Gosh.
It was a real turning point for me.
Yeah.
And very, very exciting.
And how funny as well that it was external. It wasn't sort of occurring to you beforehand.
No,
It was that sort of almost a surprise. I love that.
yes, and I suppose before I thought, oh, why didn't I go into the sciences? Why wasn't I interested in something useful to society? Art. Where am I going to go with that? And then this, turned around and thought, oh my goodness. And then my attitude changed. I thought, gosh, if I can create something, either somebody thinks is beautiful or heartfelt, or they somehow they respond to it. I mean, that's really something special. So it was a real eye opener for me.
And so did it begin right away after that then? Did you begin to get traction straight away and throw your energy behind it? Or was there a few curves first?
Well, I think the first thing I did, I was lucky enough I got a job at Madame Tussauds doing a figure there. And that in turn paid me enough to go and get somewhere to live in London. And then I was able to pay for a studio for, I think, 3 months. And in that studio, I was in Chiswick, Barley Mow Workspace. And it just so happened that Roddy Llewellyn was working there, setting up his garden design business. So I met him. I don't know if that means, because you're so young. You
Hardly.
There he was. And he gave me my first commission because he was doing gardens. And he said, well, would you like to do a bronze for this garden? I thought, well, yes, of course I would. And of course, that then paid for my next 3 to 6 months or whatever it was. And the person whose garden it was, he had a business. He said, oh, would you like to do something for my company? And then things started happening. It was just completely by luck, really, which was perhaps how these things happen, but terribly exciting.
Yeah. And also the fact is that each one of those, I mean, must give you confidence, because it validates the work, doesn't it? That someone else sees something else in it and it leads to that next thing.
I think I'm in with that, really. I'd much rather do something I wanted to do and sell it, or somebody says, oh, would you do that, or a bigger version or whatever for me. It is difficult doing commission where somebody tells you what they want and what they want you to do, because you're not working from yourself, are you? And
yeah. Well, some people really love the restrictions of those commissions. Like, it's almost like their creativity, goes up if they've got quite a narrow remit. And then there's other people who seem to just hate any restrictions whatsoever. I'm not great with I would say rules generally. I don't think I could ever work for anyone else. I'm probably unemployable because of the fact that I just can't work around other people's ways of doing things. But, I'm always amazed at how brilliant some people are at that.
I think I'm probably more like you, actually.
A sort of rebel streak. I really love your Icarus series of statues. I think if, in my sculpture park of my dreams, I would have to have one of those.
Oh.
Tell me where that came from.
Going back to my childhood, because I lived in countries like Kenya and Cyprus and Singapore, they were just amazing places. And there was always lots of sunlight and lots of sky, lots of space. And I, for some reason, had always wanted to fly. I didn't really realize that, but there was that feeling of, I just want to learn how to fly. And it wasn't until my 50th birthday that my husband gave me some flying lessons. And that just completely turned my head. And that's when I started doing Icarus pieces, because I wanted to create that feeling of flying. And I think we were on holiday in Greece. And I said, how do I make this work? And then, of course, we talked about Greek mythology, and I thought, oh my God, I have him. It's Icarus. Yeah, I started working on little Icarus figures, which then, of course, led to the the one for the Olympics, which was
Yes,
extraordinary.
magnificent. Yeah. I mean, that must have been great to see that go in place.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I mean, that was quite extraordinary because I hadn't been doing the Icarus pieces for very long when the owner of the sculpture park, Eddie Powell, came to my studio because I'd been working with him for a while. And I said, oh, I'm so excited. Look what I'm doing. Look what I'm doing. And he said, went away, said nothing. And then a week later, he said, you know, the Icarus that you're doing, he said, how'd you like to make a big one? I said, oh, I'd love to do a big one. And he said, and how would you like it if it went into the Olympic Village for the Olympics? And this was only, I think this was the autumn before the Olympics. And of course, you imagine that all that stuff has been done years before.
Yeah.
And I said, you mean there's a chance to put something in? And he said, yeah. And so that's what I did. And it was so exciting.
But gosh, that space, it really needed it too. I mean, I think it gives a dimension that it needed sculpture there for sure.
Yes. And what was wonderful during the Olympics, during the Paralympics, I was contacted by a young man, a South African, who, I mean, poor chap, he didn't have arms or legs, but he was competing. Yeah. And he said every morning he went up to the statue, sat in front of it, and it gave him courage to do his sport. And it was so touching.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, yes, that's the reason you do something, isn't it? It's amazing. So that was.
And I'm sure that although you haven't heard them, there must be multiple stories like that from the athletes that were there. Absolutely. Because it is, it's an incredibly striking sculpture.
Oh, thank you.
You were talking a bit about how the flying lessons kind of inspired that theme. Do you use inspiration generally that way? Is it some experience that sort of shoots you forward with your work, or would you say it's more internal?
I think there have been lots and lots of things, and it's either something that's going on inside, which in some cases is how you feel emotionally, like to say your relationships, but also things like I started working from bits of bone or stone that suggested figures, and that's so exciting. That's the other side, this rather the more abstracted side, and you see these figures in the stone, and you sort of bring them out by producing the piece. And so it can be something like that. Occasionally it's been a dream I've had, or a photograph, or a tiny glimpse of something. It can be almost anything. But that's what I find exciting. I love changing my work. I don't think you can necessarily tell that my work's my work. I don't know how other people feel, but I've changed so much over the years, and I find that exciting. Just trying out different things all the time.
A kind of discovery journey, it's creative discovery. But I mean, does that feed into the way that you work most days? Have you got like a routine for the studio, or is it more when inspiration strikes you?
I tend to work in sort of manic bursts of work, and I'll go in at when I was doing the Icarus, I was in at sort of 7 a.m. to 7 at night, and not wanting to leave the studio,
being dragged out.
Loving it. Unfortunately, I have a family though.
Ah, yes. There's nothing like people snapping at your heels to make you get on with other things.
Absolutely. It's a bit like when I did the Peter Scott piece. When it was unveiled, 2 weeks later, I had my 4th child, and I thought, right, I think I'm going to have a little break because I was absolutely exhausted.
Oh, dear.
A little bit of time with the children.
Yeah. The only thing is, I'm not sure what is more exhausting. Half the time I go away to work so that I get a rest.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I agree. And I love it when I'm completely immersed in some work, particularly a big piece. It's like this time last year, I was doing a really big piece for Sculpture by the Lakes, Simon Gudgeon's place. And I loved working. I was actually working at the Foundry because the piece was much too big for my studio. My studio is very small. I go there every day and whacking on great big pieces of slabs of clay. It's just the most brilliant feeling. I absolutely adore working like that, and just all day long, and there's no end to it, and I never get tired or bored or anything, love working on big pieces.
Something like that, you're having to go out every day, to obviously to the foundry. But do you have normally a routine to get you in the mode of working, or do you not need a routine? You can just slip straight in.
Well, I do sort of, if I've had a bit of a gap, a break, I do go in and I tidy up my studio. And listening to a previous interview, I think, as I've heard someone else say the same thing, I go in there and if I'm in the studio, clearing it up and moving things around, or just getting rid of all the dust and clay and everything, just being in there is almost enough.
I think it was Louisa Forbes, wasn't it? And she was saying,
Well,
she's like, I feel so girly
I
sweeping
know.
up.
Oh, that's not girly, is it? Oh,
I know. Well, I think that's how she kind of referred to it, like as if, like the 1950s or something. All we did was sweep.
well, you can see why there weren't many famous female artists, can't you? I mean, honestly, when you're trying to, you're bringing up children, you're trying to keep everything running in the house, and it still goes on. And all my children are adult, and I still get torn away by them all the time.
Absolutely. And I find that the older they get, I sort of in my head, I thought it would all get easier. But at least when they were little, I used to be able to put them down to sleep at a certain time, and I knew I had a few hours. Now it just goes on endlessly because they're awake later than I am. So they want me all the time.
Yeah, you come out the other end.
Yeah.
And I remember some years ago, a sculptor whose work I admire, Caroline Stacey, and she had 6 of her own children. In fact, I ended up with
Wow.
2 stepsons as well, so I had 6 to bring up. And she said yes, but she says now they're all adults. They can. I'm not doing anything at all, and she said I'm not getting involved with my grandchildren or anything like that. And she said the good thing is you can just keep going. And I thought, oh, that's nice. And so I thought, oh, yes, I don't actually have to stop this ever.
Yeah.
So that's sort of how I feel now, which is great. I think, well, I've got years ahead. This is brilliant.
Yeah, that's the great thing about creative industry as well, I think, is you don't think about that retirement age that other people do. You just, it's not there.
Yeah. And I've been teaching my husband how to cook too. It's brilliant.
Oh, gosh, I need to do that.
Well, I'm working now. You see, he's retired, and I think, well, okay, you can do something now.
And has it been a good career to you?
Yeah, well, I think I've had some wonderful times. Yes, I think if I'd been a man, it would be very different, but I wouldn't not have my children for anything.
No.
But I've met all sorts of amazing people and, done some wonderful things. Yeah, I think it's been fantastic.
And has there been hard times though? Has there been periods where you've thought, oh, I'm just not getting where I want to be?
I don't know that I've ever got where I want to be.
Actually, that's a really daft question.
You just sort of, yeah, I think if I'd been able to be single-minded, it would have been very different. And I do envy lots of my male contemporaries because they have been able to be single-minded in a way that, because I'm a woman, I haven't been able to.
Yeah.
Or not wanted to, because I valued the time with the children.
Yeah. And also, for me, I feel a lot that I've only got so much energy, whether that's directed into creative pursuits or so. Even if I've got the time, I just have to have the energy left. And if I've given it out, which you do very often with children and commitments like that, you're spent. So actually, even sometimes if I've got a couple of hours, I'm like, I just have nothing to give. So, I mean,
you can't be brilliant at everything, can you? So
no.
you either be completely single-minded, like Henry Moore wasn't he lucky? You just go in the studio every single day and think of nothing else. And I think a lot of men do that, but I couldn't do that.
Yeah. I know, I probably find that actually there wasn't that much to me anyway. So that's the other worrying part. If you did have all that time, I'm not sure I'd come up with the goods. Nice. Have you had 1 or 2 days where you've thought, do you know what, I should just do something else?
Well, as a career?
Yeah.
Oh no, I don't think so. No, I only thought that when I was much younger. No, once I started working, I've had I've loved creating things so much. Yeah, there's nothing quite like it. When I'm on a roll, I absolutely adore it. Doesn't mean I produce anything worth seeing, but I just love it myself, you know.
Yeah.
And once you've finished something, you get on to the next thing.
And has there been a particular statue where you've thought, yeah, you know, if I never make anything else, I've done it?
I've never felt that. I do sometimes. There are a few pieces I think, yeah, I probably couldn't have done that better. I'm pleased with, but they tend to be the more abstract pieces. I think with figurative work, you always feel that you could have done better. So, and it's part of the bronze casting process. You know, I was in the foundry most of this last week, and I spend hours and hours and hours working on the waxes, and they say, when are you going to leave, Nicola? Come on. You know, I say, oh, I won't be here long. I say, yes, you will. You'll be here days. And I'm trying to, you know, perfect the work I've already finished. So I work for, you know, days on waxes. And then when it comes through to the bronzing, I look at them, I think, that's not what it was like. And we start almost rebuilding in bronze. And I think, oh, no. So, yeah, I'm never really happy.
Satisfied. Well, I suppose there is that element that is just incredibly hard to say, right, full stop, done, like end, you know, that.
It is. No, I usually get thrown out, really.
So they send the muscle men in to clear the studio.
I remember with the, I think it was the Peter Scott. Oh no, it was the Icarus. The, you know, big pieces. When I thought how long it had taken me to produce the Icarus and the wings. You know, they took me weeks and weeks just doing the feathers and the wings, and then it goes to the foundry and they chop it up into 37 pieces, and I nearly cried.
Oh my goodness!
I can't believe it. So they're going to weld all those little bits back together again. Of course, it's never the same.
No.
And it can be really distressing.
I can imagine. 37, I'd never realised it was quite as many pieces as that.
It was, I did count the pieces. I was absolutely horrified. Yeah, I had to step away and go
cry
outside
quietly.
Yeah, I know. It was really, really upsetting.
Yeah, I know there needs to be some magical formula. The amount of problems that with sculpture that I work on, where it's the joins that cause the issues, especially over time, because they tend not to age quite at the same rate because the metallurgy is slightly different in those zones. They age at a different rate to the other parts. And so I have to do a lot of work trying to harmonise that. And it's complex. Often with more traditional patterners, they do age better in some cases. It tends to be the problems arise with particularly with lighter shades and with kind of more avant-garde patterners, ones that are less classical, that you tend to get more problems with them. But the thing is that you're not the only one that wants to weep when there's joins.
Sure.
I've seen grown men weep too.
The frustration. Yes.
Well, Nicola, thank you so much for today and chatting to us, taking the time. And I was hoping you might tell everyone where they might be able to find a little bit more about you if they'd like to.
Well, I have my website, and that's easy. That's nicolagodden.com. And I'm on Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn, possibly Pinterest as well. I'm not very good at doing all of these little social media things, so I get other people to help me. I'm hopeless. I've really enjoyed actually listening to your other interviews. I've been listening to them, and some of the sculptors I didn't know about, and I've loved seeing their work. And it's really exciting to listen to other people, and I always get such a buzz from seeing other people's work. From like other foundries and when some the people that you've been interviewing, I was thinking, how do I not know about this person?
No, well, the thing is that sculpture inspires, right? It's not that you're copying other people, but it fires you up.
It
and
does,
so it's not a competitive thing like, oh, my work's better than their work or whatever. It's actually that you admire other people for their skills.
Yes.
So,
and something that somebody else could have done, like I don't know if you know the sculptor Michael Ayrton. Obviously, he's not alive now, but he's been quite an influence, his work. And you can, even if you get an idea from something else, you start doing your piece and it turns into something completely different.
Yeah.
Because you're in there, you
Yeah.
know. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
If you try to copy something, you'd never be able to copy it, but you know, whatever you have to give goes into that work.
Yeah, it's like your filter. It's come through, and
Yeah,
and something new is produced, which is, I mean,
yeah,
you know, it's evolutionary, isn't it?
it is. And
Super.
thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this.
Something Nicola talked about in the early part of her journey really struck me, and that was when she came across that art master at art school who should have been there encouraging and nurturing talent, but it sounds like took great pleasure in trying his utmost to snuff out whatever he didn't perceive to be up to it. Doesn't he sound like a real peach? I mean, and actually I feel like I've met so many of that kind of person. But she quite generously says that in hindsight, it probably did her good and made her lean into abstraction, which she may not have done otherwise. And actually, she created some really excellent work during that very unhappy period. Gatekeepers are such a funny entity. Are they an entity? Well, they almost can be a fairy godmother type figure. Someone who can, you know, wave their wand and make every dream you've ever had happen because of their power and importance. But they can also be the absolute opposite. They can be an executioner of your talent. But as I've grown older, I've realised that they're completely insignificant, or they can be if you choose not to give them that level of power, and you decide to control that power yourself. But particularly in the younger years, that looming presence can be one of the factors that changes your direction in life. And I've certainly come across some incredibly talented people, good friends of mine, who should definitely have become professional, successful creators because they have everything that anyone needs for it, but that have ended up doing something completely different because they were sliced down at a particularly vulnerable time. And frankly, I don't see why anyone other than a viewer, or in my case with books, a reader, should decide whether a work is worthy of merit, not an arbitrary figure, a kind of critic. There are so many examples of when the public love something and the critics hate it. Now, Nicola's family has been a big feature in her life, and hats off to anyone who can complete a massive commission 2 weeks before giving birth to their 4th child. My goodness, she must be made of some seriously tough stuff, is all I can say. But she does acknowledge a truism, I think, that with a family, you are likely to be less prolific. It's impossible, I think, to give yourself over entirely to the creative life if you choose to have a family, because kids are a big disruption. I mean, let me tell you, a massive disruption, and they need your time and your input, and you want to give it to them. And I mean, my personal experience, my kids will take absolutely as much time as I can give them. If I gave them every single minute of the day, my God, they'd want more as well. But I don't think that great creative work is tethered entirely to 100% commitment to your art. As Nicola recognised in her early experiences at college, strong emotions feed work. And if happiness, another very strong emotion, is a brood of kids to you, that will manifest great work too. A creative draws from what they have inside them, and so it comes down much less to how much time you actually have and much more to what has filled up that creative well inside you. Please support the show in one of 3 ways. By buying one of my novels, you're going to love them. They're all about sculpture. Or by rating the show on any of the apps that you listen to. And the final way that you can help me out is by telling someone about the show. Everyone I've come across who's listened to the show has been so kind about it, and we want to spread the word. We want to get these interviews out to as many people as possible and get them thinking about their wonderful sculpture in public places. So please don't think it's unimportant to do it that way. It's so important, and I really appreciate it. Coming up in the final episode of this season is David Brewer-Wheal, one of the UK's leading contemporary painters and sculptors. His works have been installed in major public spaces in London, including Hampstead Heath and Hanover Square, Grosvenor Gardens and Marble Arch, among many others. And his work is just jaw-dropping. You won't want to miss the next episode where you'll be inspired by David Brewer-Wheal. If you're looking for a new book, please consider one of my novels about the dark side of the art world, where sculpture is always at the heart of the story. You can get them on the show website, on the usual online retailers, or even better, keep your local library alive, ask for them in there. Thank you for joining me today. Sculpture Vulture has been brought to you by Antique Bronze.